Talk to the cops. Just don't mention the beers.
Sorry, Steve. Not today. Hello, fellow beer drinkers, and welcome to Pause for a Pint, the show that makes you stop and think, what should I drink? And today we're going to be looking at the show that made my obsession with Eggos socially acceptable, and that's the Netflix original, Stranger Things. This episode we're really only going to be focusing on Season 1, but still, spoilers ahead. Stranger Things takes place in the small town of Hawkins, Indiana, and follows the story of 4 young boys named Mike, Dustin, Lucas, and Will. One night, Will goes missing, and the town begins an investigation to search for the missing child. As the search continues, his friends start to realize that there are stranger things going on. They soon meet a girl named Eleven and find out she has supernatural powers. We soon discover that Eleven was part of the MK Ultra experiments being conducted by Hawkins Labs. Hawkins Labs had been pushing the limits of Eleven's abilities, and in doing so had accidentally opened a gate to another world. And by opening this gate, they had also let loose the Demogorgon. Ultimately, with the help of Eleven, they are able to defeat the monster and bring Will home. Now, on paper, this bizarre plot seems like something you would find on the Sci-Fi Network.
This is crazy. It's actually crazy. This is 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 crazy.
And it's no wonder that the Duffer Brothers were rejected by more than 15 networks before finding their home at Netflix. So, how is it that something so unique can feel so familiar? The creators were able to do this through something known as a pastiche. A pastiche is an artistic work in the style that imitates that of another work, artist, or period. In other words, it's kind of like the opposite of a parody. Parodies will take common tropes to make fun of different genres, while a pastiche will use these tropes to celebrate them. For example, Austin Powers, spy movie parody; Kingsman, spy movie pastiche. Stranger Things uses the style of 80s movies that we've become familiar with to tell an original story. And there are a couple ways they do this effectively. There are shots in this show that almost recreate iconic scenes from 80s movies. Movies like E.T., The Shining, Stand By Me, Poltergeist, and a lot more. Not only is the show filled with these 80s references, but the characters themselves often rely on these references to make sense of the world around them.
Mirkwood.
It's from Lord of the Rings.
Well, The Hobbit.
Why would the chief set us up?
Lando Calrissian.
Would you shut up about Lando?
As we watch the show, we become very familiar with these character types we've seen in movies 1,000 times. But then we are surprised when these character stories take a twist. In past films, the douchebag boyfriend usually becomes exposed as, well, a douchebag. But in Stranger Things, Steve ends up redeeming himself and actually gets the girl. In other classics, kids always go to the police first for help, but are quickly ignored and dismissed by the adults.
Well, it was real, I swear.
But in Stranger Things, the kids never trust the adults, and the adults end up having to ask for the kids' help. Now, I know what you're all thinking. Andy, shut up, start talking about beer. Okay, let's talk beer. Let's start by talking about history. As we know from the opening of episode 1, the show takes place in November of 1983. Craft beer at that time was just getting back on its feet after recovering from Prohibition. And by the 80s, Americans became familiar with easy drinking lagers and pilsners. And as we can see from the show, easy drinking lagers like Schlitz were really common. Next, let's look at themes. Much like the Goonies or Stand By Me, kids are really thrusted into these dark, serious situations and often end up losing their innocence. And this theme can be reflected through the contrast between the darkness of the Upside Down and the light of the real world. So the beer counterpart to this theme would be black and tans. If we look at the color palette of season 1, there are a lot of brown earth tones, So brown ales, copper ales, and certain red ales. Styles that fit in with this time period will work great. So easy drinking pilsners and lagers. This show is also a mix and match of a bunch of references and genres, so beers that mix multiple styles will work really well. Unorthodox hybrid styles like hoppy dark ales, tart IPAs, sour stouts. So styles to avoid. I would avoid any barrel-aged or high ABV beers, and this is because although Stranger Things is only 8 episodes, the plot demands more of your attention. So if you get too drunk, the show might not make sense. But if you are gonna drink a porter or a stout, definitely focus on ones with coffee flavors to them.
Coffee and contemplation.
I would avoid a lot of beers that have very bright, colorful flavors, stuff like super fruity sours. Stay away from Hefeweizens, Belgian wheat beers, and honestly, I would avoid really hoppy beers. I would definitely save IPAs for more action-packed, explosive, fast-paced movies or shows. With all that out of the way, let's head to the kitchen and drink some beer. Wait, something doesn't feel right. That's better. For our first selection, I wanted to focus on the time period. So what people were drinking were easy drinking, light lagers and pilsners. Stranger Things takes place in the fictional town of Hawkins, Indiana. And although Hawkins is fictional, Indiana isn't. So let's start with our first selection. This is Champagne Velvet. This is their premium pills, and it's actually from the brewery Upland. Normally this brewery only does sours, which is why this brand is based off a pre-prohibition recipe, and they kind of rebrand it so it doesn't, get confused with their other brands that are mostly sours. Let's open this guy up. So this pills is 5.5% alcohol, and it actually won the silver medal for Indiana Brew Cup in 2013. So let's take a smell. Yeah, straight off the bat, it actually kind of smells like a dry champagne. As you can see from the carbonation levels in this, it is very bubbly. Makes me wonder if they actually use the champagne style yeast, which sometimes you see in some beers. It's more common in ciders. Let's try it. Very, very light bitterness or light malt build. That's actually really light, very easy drinking. I could definitely imagine people in 1982 actually drinking this. Like that shot where Hopper wakes up and there's just that beer there, brushes his teeth, and then drinks a beer. Very clean, crisp, effervescent. Let's drink a little more of this first. Roll to the next beer. For our second beer, we're really gonna look at the color palette of Stranger Things. Season 1 really has a lot of dark brown earth tone, so I felt a beer that would pair well with that would be a brown ale. So this is Beowulf Brewing's Upside Brown Ale, a brown ale, duh. First off, I'd like to thank Beowulf Brewing for really hooking me up with this beer. Let's crack this bad boy open. So for starters, this beer is 6.5% alcohol, right in the middle of not too strong, not too light. So I remember the first time I had this beer, it was super unique for a brown ale. Stevie from Beowulf, he mentioned that it was really his love for strong porters and stouts that really inspired him to make this beer. This beer is a working recipe he's been working on for the past 7 years or so, way back in his homebrew days. Let's give it a smell. Oh, straight off the bat, you get very toasty, almost like a robust porter's nose. Smelling it, it really does smell like a darker beer. Let's give it a taste. So for a brown ale, you actually get a good amount of hoppy flavor of it, but it's not like aggressively bitter or citrusy. It's this weird, kind of herbal, earthy hop really blends well with those toasty malts. And this beer is really interesting because its malt build is really complicated. He used a ridiculous amount of base malts, multiple toasted malts, and multiple caramel and crystal malts. And they just stack on top of each other to make a very complex beer for a brown ale, especially because they usually have subtly sweet, caramely in mind. This kind of takes the whole idea of brown ale and flips it upside down, pun intended. It's drier finish for a brown ale, but it's not super dry or bitter. It almost coats your tongue with a layer of that caramely, not sweet caramely toasted malt. It's very interesting. I dig it. And they pair great with Eggos. And with that, we'll move on to our next beer. Roll. And for our final beer, we're going to be looking at what we talked about earlier. A beer that really summarizes the pastiche of Stranger Things. The fact that it uses their own tropes and turn them on their head. So for our last selection, we have Power Pop from Grimm. They're from Brooklyn, New York. So this is kind of a really interesting beer because it kind of takes opposite flavor profiles and puts them together to create something weird and unusual, which I really think summarizes some of the themes of Stranger Things. So this is a dry hopped dessert Berliner Weiss with vanilla milk sugars. So for those of you who don't know, a Berliner Weiss is a type of sour. It's usually one of the most acidic and tart ones. So having something that's dry hopped, it's bitterness, it's gonna pull away from some of the sweetness. The fact that it's a dessert Berliner Weiss is really interesting because you got sweet and you got sour, and this beer hopefully will combine the two successfully. So let's try this out. Let's give this a smell. I mean, if this is dry hopped, you should get a lot of hop fruit notes. Whoa, that is... Oh, it smells great, but it's really weird. Yeah, so right off the bat, almost a bit of pineapple. This beer is kind of overwhelming if you want to cleanse your nose. Just smell skin. It's the most neutral smell to the human. Oh, there's a good amount of pineapple, but I feel like it doesn't overpower. It's not like incredibly pineapple. That smells delicious. I just need to try it. Ooh. Okay. Starts off, those hoppy notes, you really don't, for me, I don't get any bitterness out of this beer. The hops really add a lot to the smell, a lot to some citrus hop flavors up front, and that really blends in with the tartness. So you almost get this like tart fruit notes, and then you wait a second, and then you get this like subtle like creamy vanilla notes. But it's like a really delayed finish. This beer is super interesting. The sweetness, even though you get like pineapple flavors and a lot of pineapple smell, like the sweetness doesn't come through those fruits. The sweetness comes subtly at the end with that kind of creaminess. So it's really weird. It's almost like you put strawberries on top of like a cake. This beer is really good. It is super weird. It's interesting, but despite the description of the beer, like it's not as strange as it sounds. Like when you taste it, it makes sense. For being really, really complex. It's also very balanced. That subtle dry hopping, and for those of you that don't know, dry hop is after the boil, they let the hops soak in the beer, and usually that can add some amount of hops to the flavor, but it usually is to provide aroma. And dry hopping a beer with specific hops can really bring out the nose of the beer, the smell. So despite the fact that it's such a complex beer and it's well balanced because you have that kind of fleeting hop in the beginning, you get those hop flavors, but it doesn't linger. So the base of this beer was probably not hopped that much at all. And then you got that creaminess that adds complexity, but also balances it out, the tartness and those citrus hop notes in the beginning. I really think the sediment also visually in the bottle kind of reminds me of the Upside Down. That is super tasty though. I do say that the negatives of this beer is, although it does kind of lend two aspects, this is a very bright flavors out of these beers. It's very bright and colorful. This would pair maybe more with a Wes Anderson movie, something bright and colorful and quirky. Like if you look into the filmmaking, I think it pairs well with that. Stranger Things is a little too dark maybe for this beer, but still highly recommend. And with that, let's move on to our summary. And here we are. So starting with our first pick, the Champagne Velvet from Upland. The pros, it's what people would most likely be drinking in that time period. The cons of it, when you're watching the show and drinking this beer, the show's gonna overpower the beer. So we're not rolling this beer out. I can really imagine Hopper drinking this beer, you know, waking up in the morning, brushing his teeth, smoking a cigarette. For the second choice, the Upside Brown from Beowulf Brewing Company. Atmosphere-wise, totally fits with the brown color palette of season 1. Kind of fits with the show. Taste-wise, it really matches. You bring out those like subtle carameliness that reminds me of like robust porters, but it's not super strong like a robust porter. I feel like the earthy like toastiness of this beer really is more powerful than the caramely. So it's kind of like a little bit of sweet, reminds you of the kids and their shenanigans, but the roastiness really brings out, you know, the sheriff of a small town smoking a cigarette, punching security guards, doing what he's got to do to save the town. The negatives about this beer, for a brown, it's kind of hoppy. It has a little bit of hoppiness that you don't notice unless you're looking for it, but it leaves your mouth kind of dry. I think for Stranger Things, having a bit of like smokiness on the tongue would have been nice, or having something, the roastiness stay around instead of the hoppiness. And for the third one, Power Pop. Going into this show, this was definitely the beer that I was excited to try. It really summarizes the idea of taking aspects of different things, putting them together to create something new and interesting. But when you're watching the show overall, it seems to be lacking that down-to-earth darkness of the show. Overall, this one's a bit too colorful. It brings out a lot of like bright imagery when I drink it. But with all that said, there can only be one winner. But I can't do it alone. I'm gonna need help.
Blink once for yes, twice for no. Can you do that for me, sweetie? Can you do that?
Okay, so Will, what do you think? Champagne Velvet? Oh, okay. Let's Upside Brown? There we go. We got a winner. Will Byer himself. Winner, Upside Brown. Thank you all for watching Pause for a Pint episode 2. If you like what you saw here, feel free to click the link, check out last week's video, also subscribe, and in the comments below, let me know what beer you think pairs best with Stranger Things. Also, let me know what show you would like to see featured in a future episode. In next video, we will be looking at our first video game, and that's the game that took 2017 by storm. We will be reviewing PlayerUnknown Battleground.